So, good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening, depending on what time you're listening to this recordings. So today we'll be starting off a new module, and this is the module on supply. Okay, so another module and another set of new things to learn. And the background that we have today is a coffee plantation in Brazil. Okay, Brazil is the largest coffee producer in the world, and we will be using coffee as one of our examples for demonstrating an analysis of supply. So unlike the demand videos where we talked about cow's milk predominantly throughout the videos, for supply, because it's a bit more versatile, we'll be talking about different industries and different products, goods and services that we can use for analysis to understand more about supply. Okay, so let's get started. So just as a recap, remember that there are two branches of economics, microeconomics and macroeconomics. And for this term, we'll be talking about microeconomics, okay? So once again, microeconomics, just as a recap, is the branch of economics focusing on the interaction between households and firms, okay? So once again, this is in contrast with macroeconomics, which looks at the economy in aggregate. So micro, we're talking about the small scale side of things, okay? And specifically, microeconomics studies markets and the market forces of demand and supply that shape these markets. Okay, so once again, we're looking at single products. We're not looking at the economy as a whole. We're just looking at it as a single product at a time between consumers and producers. All right. And again, in microeconomics and this course, we are trying to build up this picture, which we've seen this slide before, and you've seen this guy before, Bob Schiller. He describes it as perhaps the most famous image in all of economics, and this is the demand-supply graph. Okay, and you can see that there. And again, this is what these series of lectures is building up to. That we want to make sure that we know how to build up such a curve like this. So last week we talked about demand. Last series of lectures, we talked about demand. And we talked about demand in isolation, and we remember from the law of demand that demand slopes down, right? It's a downwards, if you graph price against quantity, the demand will always go down, okay? Law of demand, if we increase the price, the quantity of goods demanded goes down, okay? Now this week, we'll be talking about supply, so just supply on its own. And next time, next series of lectures, we'll be talking about what happens when we combine both demand and supply. Okay, so our focus for this series of lectures will just be on supply. All right. So before we get started properly, let's just have the notey bits first. So supply is the desire to sell a particular product or service. If you remember from our previous discussions, we have two actors, right, in economics. We have the producers and we've got the consumers. So demand concerns itself with consumers, whereas supply, this concerns itself with producers, all right? So the supply is basically the desire to sell by the producer a particular product or service, okay? The quantity supplied is the amount of a good or service that firms want and are able to supply at a given price. So once again, quantity supplied, this talks about numbers. How much are firms willing to produce a certain good? For example, like coffee beans, how much is a producer, like a farm in Brazil, willing to supply? How many coffee beans are they willing to supply given a particular price? Okay? And as we are talking about producers, let's just have a recap from quite some time ago about the factors of production, okay? Because some of these things will come in when we start talking about supply, because remember, this is on the producer's side of things. So we kind of need to remember what producers need in order to make a product. And so we've got two definitions here. This is pulled out from the previous notes on factors of production. So we've got the word production itself, which is basically the act of combining inputs of factors of production to make goods and services. And again, like in the coffee example, the coffee beans, you have to supply different inputs, such as, the land to grow the coffee beans, the farmers to harvest and plant those beans, and so on and so forth. And the things that we combine in production, that's what we call the factors of production, okay? Now, if you remember from that module on factors of production, there are 4 factors of production. We've got land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And just as a recap again, Very quick recap. Land talks about all the actual land itself and the natural and raw material resources that we need in order to make the good. Labor talks about the people that brings the good from the stuff from where it's being produced all the way to you, the consumer. Capital is anything that can is any machinery or any infrastructure that is there in order to make in order to produce the good. So basically, anything that helps the labor to producing the good, that's capital. And finally, entrepreneurship is the guy who brings it all together. Okay, so that's the factors of production. Just a quick recap on that. So let's go now to a case study of coffee beans. All right. And here we got a picture of coffee beans. And once again, we mentioned that Brazil was the largest producer of coffee beans. However, we do have this question. What determines the amount of coffee beans a farm should produce? Now, you might say, well, it could produce as much as it can, right? And that might make sense. The more coffee beans I produce, the more I can sell, the more money I have. I think that's quite intuitive. However, you've got to remember there's such a thing as opportunity cost. So let's go back to that picture that we have of our background. So again, that's a small edition of the background photo that we have for this lecture. That's land. However, you got to remember when you plant a coffee bean, it doesn't just mean you know opportunity cost, right? The plot of land that you use to plant that coffee bean, you could plant other stuff. For example, you could plant oranges or bananas instead. So why would you plant coffee beans instead? And so this is a question of opportunity cost. If I, as a producer or as a farmer, decide I want to produce this much coffee beans, like I want to use a certain part of my land to produce coffee beans, then that means I can't produce oranges or bananas. I could instead, for example, instead of producing coffee beans, I could produce all oranges or bananas, or I could split my land into three and to produce coffee beans, a third of coffee beans, a third of oranges, and a third of bananas. But but it's not as simple as saying I'll just produce as much as I can. Okay, because there are opportunity costs associated with this. And again, it's not just oranges or bananas. You could produce something staples like rice. Okay, which again might be a more lucrative good than coffee beans. Or you can even use that land to build houses instead, right? To build houses, to build offices, and all of that. So it's not a simple clear-cut case of just produce as much as possible, because there are alternatives. And again, this goes back to the concept of opportunity cost. So now the central issue, what determines the amount of coffee beans a farm should produce, if they should produce at all? Okay? Let's have a look at the different factors that a farm might, that might determine how much coffee beans a farm could produce. So first of all, this price. If the price of coffee beans is this, just like similar to demand, right? If the price of coffee beans determine whether or not something is lucrative or something is more attractive. If the price of coffee beans per amount of effort is greater than the price of bananas, then you'd probably go and do coffee beans, right? If, however, let's say the price dropped and bananas are more profitable, then you could see farmers actually switching over to bananas instead. All right. Of course, there's more factors involved than that, but one driving point is, of course, price. And you can see, by the way, that photo. These are a picture of Brazilian reals, which is the currency of Brazil. Just a fun fact there. Of course, you also have the factors of production. Let's say, again, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. If, let's say, the price of land were to increase, let's say, for example, if somebody offered you, so let's say you own a piece of land, and every year that land generates, I don't know, let's say $10,000 based on your coffee bean production. If somebody comes in and offers you like $1 million for that piece of land, would you say no to that? Well, it depends on how you do your calculations, right? But again, the factors of production that you have, there are alternative means to using that. And if those factors of production change, then that's going to affect how much it costs for you to produce coffee beans, and hence how much profit you'll make from producing coffee beans. which, by the way, is the main goal again of a farmer or any producer, is that they want to maximize the profit that they can make from um, from making coffee beans, right? Or from making any other good. There's also another thing with coffee beans. One thing that makes coffee beans really hard to harvest is the fact that they grow in bunches. Okay, and now coffee beans don't ripen at the same time, and that's a problem. Now, the red ones, if I am not mistaken, these are the ripe ones, whereas the green ones are the non-ripe ones. So if you don't want to waste anything, you want to make sure you hand pick all of this. You can't just use a machine to pick up all of these, because machines are not sensitive enough, as far as I know, to be able to actually distinguish between the ripe and the unripe coffee beans. Now, imagine if there's a new technology involved that could actually distinguish this. Could you imagine how much labor that would save? And hence, that would decrease the amount of that would decrease the inputs that you need, and make producing coffee beans cheaper, which means you could have more profit. So this talks mainly about what happens if technology changes, right? So that could also affect the supply or the amount of coffee beans that a farm can or should produce. Next, there's also other factors like global warming or even social factors. So let's take the case of global warming, for example. With increases in temperature, droughts are becoming more and more common. And coffee itself is not a crop that doesn't use a lot of water. It does use a lot of water. And if droughts keep happening, then the cost of producing coffee beans increases, because now you have to have more irrigation. And so natural factors like this, like droughts and all of this, can greatly affect the production or the supply of coffee beans. Okay. Next, what else? You also have similar to demand. You also have expectations about the future. What do I think will happen in the future? For example, let's have a think. If you expect that there will be an increase in demand for coffee beans, then suppliers are more likely to produce more coffee beans in order to meet that demand, because there's going to be more money in the future. So that's going to affect supply, right? So expectations are also very important when it comes to the supply of coffee beans. And finally, of course, we've already previously talked about the price of other goods that you could produce instead of coffee beans. So bananas, oranges, rice, and all of this. If the price of these things can change how much coffee beans is being supplied. Okay. So we've seen with that case study that the amount of coffee beans a producer makes depends on various factors, including the price of coffee beans, the first one, right? The price of inputs to produce those coffee beans, the level of technology required to produce coffee beans, natural social factors, for example, climate change, global warming. For social factors, it could be like, let's say, taxes and all of that. So if you have taxes from the government, then that means it takes more money to produce a certain good, right? Because there's taxes now, and that's gonna add up, right? So that's going to increase. That's going to affect supply as well. And of course, there's also expectations about what will happen with the coffee bean market in the future. And finally, there's also the profitability of other farmable goods, for example, bananas, oranges, and all of that. Now, in general, we can make this even more general, okay? Because there were some things that were a bit harder to talk about when it comes to coffee beans that applies with other goods when it comes to supply. So the amount of goods supplied depends on these factors. First of all, we got price, as usual, and then we got a price of inputs, we got technology, level of technology, and we also got number of firms, which is quite simple enough. The more firms you have producing coffee beans or producing, let's say, cow's milk, then the more milk you'll probably have, right? More firms producing means more production. And again, expectations. We've got natural social factors, profitability of other goods in production, and prices of goods in joint supply. So what does that mean? For example, if you got milk and beef, right? They come from the same cow. If the price of, let's say, milk increases, and that encourages people to get more milk, then I'll probably raise more cows. And it just so happens, oh, I have more cows, I could probably make more beef because I have more cows, right? So that also affects the supply. We'll talk more about these later, okay? And once again, just to make things simpler, we can put call these icons or diagrams next to them, just so we can have a picture, see what these different factors are, okay? And we'll be using these ones. And again, this is very similar to the demand function, in case you haven't noticed by now. There's that word again, depends on. And we've seen this in demand function. We've seen this with the factors production, with the production function. When we have the word depends on, that just means we can just reword that to function. Right? Again, or the number of goods produced or supplied depends on all these factors. And once again, when we have the word depends, it just means function, which we can again mathematically represent with the f, and then all of this in parentheses. And again, that's just the word function. So don't panic again. We'll be doing the same approach as we did before. So don't panic. So that's our introduction to supply. So let's look at what the road ahead looks like. And again, very similar to the demand lectures. We will take a ceteris paribus approach, meaning again, one thing at a time, right? So again, we start with the price of the good, and then we'll look at other factors in play. So we'll start first with price. That will lead us to the law of supply, and then after we have constructed our supply curve, we'll see now what happens to the supply curve when we change the different when we change the other factors. Okay, when we change the other things that can influence supply. So again, very similar to the demand lectures, and you're gonna see here, aside from the fact that we'll be using different case studies and examples, this is very similar to the demand function, except we'll just look at how things relate to each other. All right. So unlike the demand lectures, we will be looking at several goods and services and not just one. So thank you for listening, and see you all, or you'll hear from me in the next recording. Thank you. And just some image credits. All right. Thank you.